At a certain hour every night, Jimmy Kimmel walks onto a brightly lit stage and does what he's done for years. He smiles, pauses just long enough for the audience to settle, and starts talking like he's been talking to them his whole life. The timing is precise. The delivery feels loose, almost careless. He comes off like someone who never had to try too hard to be funny. That's the version most people know. The relaxed posture. The shrugging sarcasm. The guy who looks like he'd rather be anywhere else, but somehow makes that indifference work in his favor. There's a rhythm to it. A sense that he's in control, even when he's pretending not to be. But if you watch long enough, really watch, you start to notice small fractures in that surface. Not obvious ones. Nothing that breaks the show. Just moments that don't quite line up with the persona. A pause that lingers half a second too long. A joke that lands, but seems to carry something heavier underneath it. A look that flickers across his face before the next line resets everything back to normal. It's easy to miss if you're not looking for it. And most people aren't. Because Jimmy Kimmel built his career on making sure you don't have to look too closely. He grew up in a part of Las Vegas that wasn't the version tourists see. Long before the Strip became shorthand for spectacle, it was just a place where families tried to carve out something stable in the middle of constant motion. His father worked for the American Gaming Association, handling jobs that kept him tied to the casino industry, while his mother managed the quieter, more domestic side of things. On the surface, it was a conventional setup. A working household. Structured. Predictable. But stability, especially for a kid, isn't just about routines. It's about emotional consistency. And that's harder to measure. Jimmy was the kind of kid who paid attention to how people spoke, not just what they said. He noticed tone shifts. The way conversations changed depending on who was in the room. That kind of awareness doesn't come from nowhere. It usually develops when a child feels the need to read between the lines, when what's said directly isn't always the full story. He gravitated toward radio early, not because it was glamorous, but because it felt accessible. There was something about hearing voices through a speaker, detached, controlled, edited, that made sense to him. Radio personalities didn't have to show everything. They could shape how they were perceived in a way real life didn't allow. By the time he was a teenager, he wasn't just listening. He was trying to understand the mechanics. Timing. Silence. Inflection. He studied it the way some kids study sports or music. And like most things that start as curiosity, it slowly became something closer to necessity. At home, there wasn't any major, defining catastrophe. No single event that explains everything. But there doesn't have to be. Sometimes it's the accumulation of smaller, less visible tensions that leaves a deeper imprint. The kind that doesn't announce itself but still shapes how someone learns to exist in the world. Jimmy learned early that humor could redirect attention. If something felt uncomfortable, a joke could change the temperature of the room. If a conversation edged too close to something serious, humor could pull it back. Not as a defense mechanism in the obvious sense, more like a reflex that developed over time. That instinct followed him into adulthood. When he first started working in radio, it wasn't glamorous. Late shifts, low pay, stations that barely had an audience. He bounced between small markets, trying to find any foothold that might lead somewhere better. There's a kind of loneliness in that phase of a career that doesn't get talked about much. You're working constantly, but no one really sees it. You're building something, but it doesn't feel like progress yet. And rejection isn't dramatic. It's quiet. A call that doesn't come. A contract that doesn't renew. A program director who decides to go in a different direction. Each one on its own feels manageable, but over time they stack up. Jimmy didn't have the kind of early career that suggested inevitability. There wasn't a clear path leading upward. It was uneven. At times, it looked like it might stall completely. He moved through different formats, sports radio, comedy segments, talk shows, trying to figure out where he fit, or if he fit anywhere at all. That's the part people tend to skip over when they look back at someone successful. The uncertainty. The stretches where nothing feels secure. Eventually, he found a kind of rhythm in co-hosting, particularly on shows where his role wasn't to dominate but to respond. It suited him. He could observe, react, adjust. That ability, to read a room, even an invisible one, became one of his defining traits. When television started to enter the picture, It wasn't a sudden leap. It was another transition that could have gone either way. His work on The Man Show gave him visibility, but it also boxed him into a very specific kind of persona. Crude, irreverent, designed for a particular audience. It worked, but it wasn't the full picture. And that's where the tension starts to build. Because when a version of you becomes successful, there's pressure to stay there, even if it doesn't fully align with who you are. The industry doesn't reward nuance. It rewards consistency. Repeat what works. Don't complicate it. For a while, Jimmy did exactly that. But underneath, something else was forming. A quieter awareness that the persona people responded to wasn't sustainable forever. Not emotionally, not creatively, and maybe not even honestly. That awareness didn't show up all at once. It developed gradually, in moments that didn't seem significant at the time. Interviews that felt off. Jokes that landed but didn't feel right afterward. Conversations behind the scenes where he realized how differently he was perceived compared to how he saw himself. By the time he was offered the chance to host his own late-night show, it looked like the culmination of everything he'd been working toward. And in many ways it was. A national platform. Creative control. The kind of opportunity that changes everything. But stepping into that role also meant confronting the gap between who he'd been on television and who he actually was. Late night isn't just about jokes. It's about presence. Consistency. The ability to show up every night and make it feel effortless. That's a different kind of pressure. Less about getting attention, more about maintaining it. Jimmy adjusted. Slowly. He shifted the tone of his humor. Pulled back from the more abrasive edges. Allowed more of his natural personality to come through. It wasn't a reinvention in the dramatic sense. More like a gradual correction. But even as his public image evolved, the internal dynamics didn't necessarily simplify. Because success, especially the kind that's highly visible, doesn't resolve the patterns you develop early in life. If anything, it amplifies them. The instinct to deflect. The tendency to observe rather than fully engage. The reliance on humor as a way to manage discomfort. Those don't disappear when the cameras turn on. If anything, they become part of the performance. And that's where things start to get complicated. By the time Jimmy Kimmel settled into the rhythm of late-night television, the structure of his life had become almost mechanical. The show demanded it. Writers' meetings in the afternoon. Rehearsals. Rewrites. Taping. Then, once the lights went down, a brief window of quiet before the cycle restarted. From the outside, it looked like stability. A steady platform. A clear identity. But repetition has a way of exposing things that distraction can hide. When you're doing the same thing every day, small inconsistencies don't disappear, they become more noticeable. And for Jimmy, there was always a subtle tension between performance and authenticity. It showed up in how he adjusted his tone over time. Early in his late-night career, the humor leaned safer, more observational. There was an effort to fit into the expectations that came with the format, something shaped by decades of hosts who came before him. David Letterman had built his reputation on sharp detachment. Jay Leno leaned into familiarity and accessibility. The blueprint was there, and for a while, Jimmy seemed to exist somewhere in between. But imitation, even subtle imitation, creates friction if it doesn't fully align with who you are. Over time, that friction became harder to ignore. There were moments, small at first, where Jimmy let something more personal slip through. A comment that wasn't purely comedic. A reaction that felt less controlled. They weren't dramatic shifts, but they stood out precisely because they weren't part of the usual rhythm. Audiences noticed. Not consciously, maybe, but enough to feel that something was changing. Behind the scenes, the pressure didn't just come from the show itself. It came from the expectation to maintain relevance in a landscape that was constantly shifting. Late-night television wasn't what it had been even a decade earlier. The rise of online platforms, viral clips, and fragmented audiences meant that a monologue wasn't just for the studio anymore. It had to work in isolation, stripped of context, competing for attention in a completely different environment. That kind of visibility changes how you approach your work. It's no longer about the room in front of you. It's about an invisible audience that's harder to predict, harder to read, and often quicker to react. For someone like Jimmy, who built his instincts on reading people in real time, That shift introduced a new layer of uncertainty. And uncertainty has a way of triggering old patterns. There were periods where his tone became sharper, more direct. Political commentary started to take up more space in his monologues. It wasn't a calculated pivot at first. It felt more like a response, an attempt to process what was happening in the world using the only platform he had. But that shift came with consequences. Late Night had always flirted with politics, but leaning into it more heavily meant redefining his relationship with the audience. Some viewers responded strongly. Others didn't. The division wasn't always clean or predictable. And for someone whose career had been built on broad appeal, that kind of polarization wasn't easy to navigate. It's one thing to tell jokes that everyone can laugh at. It's another to say something that half the audience might disagree with. Jimmy didn't back away from it. But staying in that space required a different kind of emotional investment. It wasn't just performance anymore. It was exposure. And exposure, even when it's controlled, carries weight. Around this time, the boundaries between his public and private life began to shift in a more significant way. When his son was born with a serious heart condition, the situation forced something into the open that had previously stayed contained. It wasn't part of the show. It wasn't material. It was personal in a way that didn't translate easily into the structure he'd spent years building. And yet, he chose to talk about it. Not immediately. Not impulsively. But when he did, the tone was different from anything he'd done before. It wasn't framed as a performance. There was no attempt to soften it with humor. It was direct, specific, and in some ways, uncomfortable to watch. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. That moment changed how people saw him. Not entirely. The persona didn't disappear, but it expanded. The distance between the host and the person narrowed in a way that late-night television doesn't usually allow. For Jimmy, that shift came with its own complications. Opening that part of his life created a new expectation, whether intentional or not, that he would continue to be that version of himself. More transparent, more emotionally available. But vulnerability, especially in a public setting, isn't something you can replicate on demand. It doesn't follow a schedule. There's a cost to it. And once you've shown that side of yourself, it becomes harder to retreat fully back into the safety of performance. At the same time, the show had to continue. The jokes didn't stop. The structure didn't change. Night after night, he still had to step onto that stage and do the same job he'd always done. That contrast, between what he was dealing with privately and what he was expected to present publicly, created a kind of quiet strain. It wasn't visible in any obvious way. There were no breakdowns on air. No disruptions to the format. But consistency can be misleading. Just because something looks stable doesn't mean it feels that way from the inside. There were also external pressures that didn't always align neatly with his own instincts. Controversies surfaced, some tied to older material that didn't age well, others connected to the evolving standards of what audiences expected from public figures. In each case, the response required a level of reflection that went beyond simple damage control. For someone whose career had been built on humor that occasionally pushed boundaries, those moments forced a reassessment. Not just of what he said in the past, but of how those choices were perceived in a different context. It's easy to look back at earlier work and separate it from who you are now. But public memory doesn't always make that distinction. And when those moments resurface, they don't just challenge your reputation, they challenge your sense of identity. Jimmy addressed some of it publicly, apologized, acknowledged the shift. But acknowledgement doesn't erase the underlying tension. It just brings it into clearer focus. Through all of this, the one constant was the show. Night after night, he returned to that stage, delivered the monologue, conducted interviews, maintained the rhythm. But if you watched closely, there was a gradual change in how he carried himself. Less reliance on detachment. More moments where he allowed silence to sit instead of filling it immediately. A different kind of pacing. Not slower, exactly, but more deliberate. It wasn't a reinvention. It was an adjustment that reflected something internal rather than external. And that internal shift didn't resolve everything. If anything, it made certain questions harder to ignore. Questions about what part of the persona was still necessary, what parts were habits that no longer served a purpose, and whether the version of himself that existed on stage was still aligned with the person who walked off it. Those aren't questions with clear answers, especially in a career where consistency is part of the expectation. But they don't go away just because they're inconvenient. They tend to surface in quieter moments, after the audience leaves, when the structure falls away and there's nothing left to perform. And for someone like Jimmy, someone who built his identity around managing those spaces, that kind of stillness can be more challenging than anything that happens on camera. Because without the performance, there's nothing to redirect the attention, nothing to soften what's underneath. Just the awareness that the version people recognize is only part of the story. There isn't a clean moment where everything breaks. With Jimmy Kimmel, it doesn't happen that way. There's no single collapse, no visible unraveling that forces a reset. What happens instead is slower, harder to define. A gradual accumulation of pressure that never quite spills over, but also never fully disappears. That's what makes it difficult to see from the outside. Because the show continues. Every night, the same entrance, the same desk, the same expectation that whatever is happening beyond that stage doesn't interfere with what happens on it. And for years, Jimmy had built the kind of discipline that allowed him to separate those worlds. Or at least make it look that way. But separation isn't the same as resolution. Off camera, the questions don't go away. They just lose their audience. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from maintaining a version of yourself that people depend on. Not because it's false exactly, but because it's incomplete. It leaves things out. It simplifies. And over time, the gap between what's shown and what's felt can become harder to navigate. For Jimmy, that gap started to feel more noticeable as his career stabilized. Success, once it becomes consistent, removes certain distractions. Early on, uncertainty keeps you focused on survival. Getting the next job, holding on to momentum, proving that you belong. But once those questions are answered, something else takes their place. You start asking different questions. Not about whether you can do the job, but about what the job is doing to you. Late-night television isn't designed for introspection. It's designed for output, volume, consistency. The expectation isn't that you evolve internally. It's that you deliver externally, night after night. And for a long time, Jimmy met that expectation. But there were moments, subtle ones, where the performance didn't fully mask what was underneath. A shift in how he approached certain topics. Less distance, more investment. When he spoke about issues that mattered to him, the tone changed in a way that wasn't entirely comfortable. Not because it was forced, but because it revealed something that didn't fit neatly into the structure of a comedy show. Created a kind of dissonance. Some viewers connected with it. Others resisted it. But the reaction itself wasn't the core issue. The real tension came from having to reconcile those moments with the broader expectation of what he was supposed to be. A host. A comedian. Constant. Not someone still figuring things out in real time. There's also the matter of time. Jimmy isn't the same person who started in radio, or even the same person who first stepped into late night. The instincts are still there, the observational awareness, the ability to read a room, but the context has changed. Age brings a different kind of perspective, whether you're looking for it or not. Things that once felt simple don't land the same way. Jokes that used to come easily require more consideration. Not because he's lost the ability, but because the framework around those jokes has shifted. The audience has changed. The culture has changed. And he's changed. Adapting to that isn't just a professional challenge. It's personal. Because it forces you to reconsider what parts of yourself are essential and what parts were shaped by the environment you were working in. For someone like Jimmy, whose identity has always been closely tied to how he communicates, that process isn't abstract. It shows up in the smallest details. The pacing of a sentence. The decision to push a joke further or pull it back. The choice to speak at all, or let something pass without comment. None of those decisions happen in isolation. They're influenced by everything that's come before, every success, every criticism, every moment where the audience responded in a way that didn't quite match his expectations. And over time, that accumulation creates a kind of internal negotiation. What do you keep? What do you let go? What do you pretend doesn't bother you, even when it does? There have been public moments where that negotiation became visible. Controversies that resurfaced older material, forcing him to address parts of his past that no longer aligned with who he is now. Those situations aren't unique in the entertainment industry, but they're rarely simple. They don't just ask for an apology, they ask for context, for self-awareness, for a willingness to acknowledge that growth isn't always linear. Jimmy handled those moments in a way that was measured, but you could sense the weight behind them. Not just the immediate reaction, but the broader realization that nothing stays contained anymore. The past doesn't fade quietly. It waits. And when it returns, it does so in a different environment, with different expectations. That awareness changes how you move forward. It makes you more careful, but also more aware of how easily things can be misunderstood. And for someone who built a career on communication, that kind of uncertainty can be unsettling, because it challenges the one thing you rely on most, your ability to connect. At the same time, the personal side of his life continues to exert its own pressure. Parenthood, especially after what he experienced with his son's health, reshapes priorities in ways that aren't always visible to the audience. It introduces a different kind of responsibility, one that doesn't align neatly with the demands of a nightly television schedule. There's no script for balancing those worlds. No clear way to compartmentalize when one inevitably affects the other. And yet, the expectation remains that he will. That he'll step onto that stage and deliver the same consistency people have come to expect, regardless of what's happening beyond it. For Jimmy, the breaking point isn't a moment. It's a realization. A quiet acknowledgement that the separation he's maintained for so long isn't as solid as it once seemed. That the persona and the person aren't operating independently anymore. They're overlapping. And that overlap brings with it a different kind of vulnerability. Not the kind that's expressed in a single emotional monologue, but the kind that exists in the day-to-day reality of continuing to show up while carrying things that don't resolve cleanly. That's the part people don't always see. The absence of resolution. Because there isn't a clear ending to this kind of story. No point where everything aligns and the tension disappears. What exists instead is a continuous adjustment. A process of recalibrating how much of himself he's willing to bring into the public space, and how much he needs to keep separate to maintain some sense of stability. And even that balance isn't fixed. It shifts. Some nights, the distance is easier to maintain. Other nights, it isn't. The audience might not notice the difference, but that doesn't mean it isn't there. It always is. Now, when Jimmy walks out onto that stage, the performance hasn't changed in any obvious way. The structure is the same. The timing is intact. The audience still responds the way they always have. But underneath it, there's a different awareness. Less about proving something, more about sustaining something. And those are not the same. Because proving requires energy. Sustaining requires endurance. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that builds quietly over time. And maybe that's where the real story sits. Not in the visible highs or the manageable setbacks, but in that ongoing effort to hold everything together without letting any one part take over. From the outside, it still looks effortless. That hasn't changed. But if you watch closely, past the timing, past the delivery, past the version of Jimmy Kimmel that people recognize, you can start to see the outline of something else. Not a contradiction exactly. More like an unfinished equation. Still shifting. Still adjusting. Still not entirely resolved. And maybe it never will be. Not in the way people expect, anyway. Because some stories don't end with clarity. They just continue, quietly, in the background. Long after the lights go out, long after the audience has stopped paying attention. And the question isn't whether everything eventually makes sense. It's whether it ever needed to.